The restaurant fell completely silent. 50 wealthy patrons watched as coins scattered across the marble floor, rolling in every direction, clinking against table legs and chair feet. And not one person said a word. That cold Saturday evening in November 2016 started like any other at the Grand Peachtree Restaurant in Buckhead, Atlanta. For over 40 years, this establishment had been the crown jewel of Atlanta's elite dining scene. It was the kind of place where senators closed deals over $100 steaks, where old money met new money, and where the who's who of Georgia society gathered to see and be seen. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. White tablecloths were pressed to perfection. Waitstaff moved silently between tables like ghosts, appearing only when needed, disappearing when they weren't. The air smelled of expensive wine, and even more expensive perfume. And on this particular evening, a woman named Denise Marie Carter was working the floor. Now, if you had looked at Denise that night, you would have seen exactly what everyone else saw. A 34-year-old black woman in a press uniform, her hair pulled back neatly, a polite smile on her face as she moved between tables. Nothing remarkable, nothing special, just another waitress trying to earn tips from folks who could spend more on dinner than she made in a week. But you would have been wrong, dead wrong, because Denise Carter was not what she appeared to be. Not even close. But we'll get to that later. Right now, I need to tell you about Margaret Ashford III. Margaret Eleanor Ashford III was old Atlanta money, and I mean old money, the kind of money that had been passed down through 4 generations, the kind of money that came with its own zip code and its own set of rules. Her great-grandfather had made his fortune in textiles during the early 1900s, building factories across Georgia while other men were still figuring out how to read. Her grandfather had tripled that fortune through real estate, buying up half of downtown Atlanta when it was still just a sleepy southern town. Her father had invested wisely in Coca-Cola stock before anyone knew that brown sugar water would become the most recognized brand on planet Earth. By the time Margaret inherited the family fortune at age 25, she had never worked a day in her life, never filled out a job application, never worried about rent or groceries or whether the lights would stay on. She had never been told no by anyone who mattered, and that kind of privilege, when mixed with a cold heart and an empty soul, creates a particular kind of cruelty that's hard to describe unless you've experienced it. At 62 years old, Margaret Ashford was known throughout Atlanta's high society for 2 things. First, her extravagant charity galas. She threw parties that made the newspapers, raised money for causes that made her look good, and smiled for cameras while wearing jewelry that could feed a small country. Second, and this was the part that didn't make the papers, she was known for her absolute disdain for anyone she considered beneath her. And that list of people was very, very long. On that November evening, Margaret walked into the Grand Peachtree with her daughter Victoria and her 2 granddaughters for what she called a girls' dinner. She was wearing a cream-colored Chanel suit that cost more than most people's cars. Her Birkin bag, custom-made and shipped directly from Paris, hung for her arm like a trophy. Her jewelry caught the light of the chandeliers and threw it back in everyone's face. The host, a young man named Timothy who knew better than to keep Mrs. Ashford waiting, escorted them immediately to the best table in the house, a corner booth with a perfect view of the entire restaurant so Margaret could see everyone, and more importantly, everyone could see her, and Denise Carter was assigned to their table. From the moment Denise approached with menus and a warm smile, something shifted in the air. Margaret's eyes did that thing. That cold, dismissive thing that certain people do when they've already decided you're not worth their time. She looked at Denise the way you might look at a stain on your shoe. "Good evening, ladies," Denise said, her voice professional and warm. "Welcome to the Grand Peachtree. My name is Denise, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. Can I start you off with something to drink? Perhaps some wine, or maybe our specialty cocktails?" Margaret didn't look up from her phone. "Just water. And make sure the glasses are clean this time. Last time I was here, there were spots." The granddaughters giggled. Victoria smirked. "Of course, ma'am," Denise nodded, her smile never wavering. "I'll make sure of it." She walked away with her dignity intact. But her co-worker Charlene, who was watching from near the kitchen, shook her head. She had worked at the Grand Peachtree for 7 years, and she knew trouble when she saw it. That Ashford woman. Charlene whispered when Denise came to pick up the water glasses. She's the worst. I've seen her make grown men cry. You be careful. Denise just smiled. I'll be fine. But Charlene wasn't so sure. The dinner proceeded for the next hour, with a steady stream of small humiliations. When Denise brought the appetizers, Margaret complained that the bread wasn't warm enough. When she brought the salads, Victoria snapped her fingers in the air to get Denise's attention, like she was calling a dog. When the entrees arrived, Margaret announced loudly that her steak was a shade too pink and demanded a new one, even though the first one was cooked exactly as she had ordered it. And the granddaughters? Those little girls, maybe 7 and 9 years old, treated the floor like a garbage can. They dropped food everywhere, threw pieces of bread at each other, spilled their Shirley Temples on the expensive carpet. And when Denise bent down to clean up the mess, Margaret looked at her daughter and said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Well, I suppose that's what the help is for." Victoria laughed. The granddaughters laughed. And Denise just kept cleaning, her jaw tight, her eyes focused on the floor. You see, what Margaret Ashford didn't understand was that Denise Carter had been through worse. Much worse. She had buried a husband. She had fought a battle against lawyers and insurance companies. She had lost nearly everything and still found a way to keep going. A woman like Margaret was just another storm to weather, another fire to walk through, another test of the character her grandmother had built in her since she was a little girl. Baby girl. Her grandmother Loretta Mae Jenkins used to say, "Your circumstances don't define you. Your character does. And character is built in the fire, not in the comfort." Denise kept those words close to her heart. They had gotten her through the darkest nights. They would get her through this dinner, too. But then the check came. The total was $347.82. A single meal that cost more than Denise made in 2 weeks of double shifts. She placed the leather check holder on the table with a polite nod and stepped back, waiting. Margaret barely glanced at the bill. She reached into her Birkin bag, that designer purse worth more than Denise made in 3 months, and pulled out 4 crisp $100 bills. She slid them across the table. "Keep the change," she said dismissively. The change would be $52.18. A decent tip. Not great, but decent. Denise reached for the bills. And that's when it happened. Margaret's hand came down on top of Denise's, hard, pressing her fingers against the table with more force than necessary. "Actually," Margaret said, her voice dripping with something Denise couldn't quite name, "I've changed my mind." She snatched the $100 bills back, crumpling them slightly as she shoved them into her purse. Then she reached deeper into that designer bag and pulled out a handful of coins. Quarters, dimes, nickels, pennies. A whole fistful of loose change. And she threw them onto the floor at Denise's feet. The coins hit the marble and scattered everywhere, rolling under the table, clinking against chair legs, spinning in circles before finally falling flat. The restaurant went dead silent. Every conversation stopped. Every fork paused mid-bite. Every eye turned to their table. "There's your tip," Margaret announced, her voice loud and clear, making sure everyone in the restaurant could hear. $52.18. In coins. I figure that's more money than you've ever seen at once anyway. Denise stood frozen. Her face grew hot. Her heart pounded against her ribs, so hard she thought it might break through. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she refused to let them shake openly. She refused to give this woman that satisfaction. Victoria laughed nervously, glancing around to watching faces. The granddaughters stared with wide eyes, too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to know it was something bad. Margaret wasn't finished. "Well?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife through butter. "Pick them up. That's your tip. Get on your knees and pick them up." Denise didn't move. I said, "Pick them up." Margaret's eyes were cold as ice, hard as diamonds. "Or don't you want the money? I'm sure someone in your situation needs every penny they can get." Denise looked around the room, searching for help, for someone, anyone, to speak up. The restaurant was full of wealthy patrons, business people, professionals. Supposedly good people who went to church on Sunday and donated to charity and prided themselves on being decent human beings. Not one of them said a word. They looked away. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They suddenly became very interested in their food or their phones or the patterns on the ceiling. Gerald, the restaurant manager who had known Margaret Ashford for 20 years and knew exactly what kind of woman she was, stood by the host stand watching. His face was blank. His hands were still. He did nothing. And in that moment, Denise Carter felt truly and completely alone. But then, in the silence of her own mind, her grandmother's voice spoke. That steady, warm voice that had guided her through every difficult moment of her life. Character is built in the fire, baby girl, not in the comfort. Denise took a breath, and then, with tears burning in the corners of her eyes but refusing to fall, she got down on her knees. One by one, she picked up those coins. Every quarter, every dime, every nickel, every single penny. She crawled under the table to retrieve the ones that had rolled away. She reached between chair legs. She collected each piece of change with steady hands, even though her heart was breaking. Even though her soul was screaming. It took her 4 full minutes. And Margaret Ashford watched with a satisfied smile the entire time. She sipped her water. She adjusted her jewelry. She made sure to make eye contact with the patrons at nearby tables, as if to say, this is a natural order of things. This is how the world works. When Denise finally stood, coins heavy in her apron pocket, she did something that no one in that restaurant expected. Something that made Margaret's smile flicker just slightly. She looked Margaret Ashford directly in the eyes. Not with anger, not with hatred, not with tears streaming down her face. With something else. Something Margaret couldn't quite identify. Something that, if she had been paying attention, might have worried her. "Thank you, ma'am," Denise said, her voice steady and clear, not a single tremor in it. "I hope you have a blessed evening." Then she turned and walked away. Her back was straight. Her steps were measured. Her head was held high. She made it all the way to the kitchen before the tears finally fell. Charlene was there waiting, arms open wide. She held Denise while she cried, whispering words of comfort that didn't really help but meant everything anyway. And out in the restaurant, Margaret Ashford gathered her things, kissed her granddaughters on the head, and walked out the front door without a second thought. Just another Saturday evening. Just another meal. Just another person she had stepped on without consequence. Or so she thought. Because here's the thing that Margaret Ashford didn't know that night. Here's the thing that nobody in that restaurant knew. In the bottom of Denise Carter's worn leather purse, beneath her wallet and her phone, and the leftover animal crackers she had packed for her twin daughters, was something that would change everything. And what happened next? What Denise Carter did with that something? Well, that's a story you're not going to believe. But I promise you, every word of it is true. In the bottom of Denise's worn leather purse, beneath her wallet, her phone, and the leftover animal crackers she packed for her daughters, was something worth more than everything Margaret Ashford owned. A small flash drive, black plastic, nothing special to look at. You could buy one just like it at any office supply store for $15. But what was on that flash drive? That was priceless. Now, to understand what I'm about to tell you, you need to forget the image of Denise Carter on her knees picking up coins. You need to forget the waitress uniform and the polite smile and the pressed apron. Because that woman, the one Margaret Ashford thought she saw, was only the surface. The real Denise Carter was someone else entirely. Denise Marie Carter held a master's degree in computer science from Georgia Tech. Not just any program, mind you, but one of the most prestigious and competitive technology programs in the entire country. She had graduated with honors. Her thesis on algorithmic detection of systemic bias in payroll systems had been published in 3 academic journals. Her professors had called her brilliant. One of them, a man who had worked at Microsoft for 20 years, had told her she was the most naturally gifted coder he had ever taught. So how did someone like that end up serving overcooked steaks to ungrateful rich people in Buckhead? The answer begins with a man named Marcus Carter. Marcus was Denise's husband, her high school sweetheart, the father of her twin daughters, Jasmine and Joy. He was the kind of man who woke up every morning with a smile and went to bed every night with a prayer of gratitude. He worked construction because he loved building things with his hands. He loved the feeling of creating something from nothing, of looking at a finished building and knowing his labor was part of it. 2 years before that night at the Grand Peachtree, Marcus was working on a high-rise project in downtown Atlanta. The developers were wealthy men who cut corners wherever they could. Safety inspections were rushed. Equipment was outdated. Warnings from workers were ignored. On a Tuesday afternoon in September 2014, a crane cable snapped. Marcus Carter died on impact. He was 32 years old. When Denise got the phone call, she was at home with the twins. They were 5 years old. They were playing with dolls in the living room. They didn't understand why Mommy suddenly fell to the floor crying. They didn't understand why Mommy couldn't stop screaming. The company Marcus worked for was owned by developers with deep pockets and deeper connections. They had teams of lawyers whose entire job was to make problems disappear. And Denise Carter, a young widow with twin daughters and a mountain of grief, was just another problem to be handled. The life insurance claim was denied. The lawyer cited a technicality buried deep in the paperwork, something about improper documentation of Marcus's employment status. It was nonsense. Everyone knew it was nonsense. But nonsense backed by expensive lawyers has a way of becoming the truth in courtrooms. Denise fought back. She hired her own lawyer, a man named Patterson who promised he would get justice for Marcus. But justice cost money. The legal battle dragged on for months, then a year, then longer. Every hearing, every motion, every delay drained another piece of Denise's savings. She lost the house in Stone Mountain, the house where she and Marcus had planned to raise their girls, the house with a backyard where Marcus had built a swing set with his own hands. Gone. She lost her car, sold it to pay legal fees. She lost her position at a small tech startup where she had been working. She couldn't afford childcare. She had missed too many days for court appearances and depositions. Eventually, her boss, a man who had always praised her work, called her into his office and said he was sorry, but the company needed someone more reliable. By the time November 2016 rolled around, Denise Marie Carter, Georgia Tech graduate, brilliant software developer, was living in a one-bedroom apartment in East Point. The twins slept in the bedroom. Denise slept on the couch. She worked double shifts at the Grand Peachtree just to keep the lights on and food on the table. But here's what nobody knew. Here's the secret she carried with her every single day. For 18 months, in stolen moments between shifts, in the quiet hours after the girls went to bed, in the precious free time she had found at the public library's computer stations, Denise had been building something. She called it Equal Pay. It was a revolutionary software system designed to automatically detect and correct wage disparities in real time. Using algorithms she had developed during her master's program and refined through 3 years of additional research, the software could analyze payroll data, identify patterns of discrimination, and flag issues before they became lawsuits. It was elegant. It was brilliant. It was a kind of innovation that could change how every major corporation in America handled compensation. And it was finished. The flash drive in her purse contained a complete working version of the software, along with all her documentation, her pitch deck, and her business plan. She carried it with her everywhere she went. It was too valuable to leave at home, too important to risk. What Denise had been waiting for was a meeting that was scheduled for the following Monday, a meeting with a venture capital firm in Midtown Atlanta called Davidson and Monroe Capital. They had agreed to hear her pitch. One shot, one opportunity. Everything she had worked for came down to that meeting. But here's something else nobody knew. The reason Denise Carter chose to work at the Grand Peachtree wasn't just to pay her bills. It was strategic. The Grand Peachtree was where Atlanta's wealthiest and most connected people came to dine. It was where business deals were made over $300 bottles of wine. It was where power moved and money changed hands. For 3 months, Denise had been watching, listening, learning. She observed how wealthy people carried themselves. She noted the language they used, the phrases that signaled confidence, the subtle ways they communicated dominance and control. She listened to business conversations at nearby tables, picking up on negotiation tactics, investment terminology, the rhythm and flow of how deals were discussed. She was preparing herself, teaching herself, getting ready for the moment when she would walk into that conference room and pitch her software to investors who would judge her in the first 30 seconds. That night, after the coins, after the humiliation, after the tears in the kitchen, Denise went home to her small apartment in East Point. The twins were already asleep, watched by a neighbor who Denise paid $20 she couldn't afford. She sat on the couch in the darkness, the coins still heavy in her pocket. She pulled them out and looked at them. $52.18. Her humiliation measured in quarters and dimes. Something crystallized inside her in that moment. Not anger, not hatred, not even resentment. Clarity. She knew, with sudden and perfect certainty, exactly who she needed to become, exactly what she needed to do, exactly how she was going to rise from this floor and never kneel for anyone again. But here's the part that still gives me chills. Here's the twist that changes everything. Remember how I told you the restaurant went silent when Margaret threw those coins? Remember how every wealthy patron suddenly became very interested in their food or their phones? Remember how not one person spoke up? That wasn't exactly true. One person watched the entire scene unfold without looking away. One person saw everything from beginning to end. A 70-year-old black man in an expensive but understated suit, sitting alone at a corner table with a glass of bourbon and a plate he had barely touched. His name was Charles Monroe. Charles Monroe had made his fortune in telecommunications during the 1990s, building one of the first black-owned telecom companies in the Southeast. He had started with nothing, worked his way up from poverty in rural Alabama, and through brilliance and determination and a refusal to accept the limitations others tried to place on him, had become one of the wealthiest self-made businessmen in Georgia. Now, at 70, he spent his time investing in the next generation. His firm, Davidson and Monroe Capital, focused specifically on funding promising entrepreneurs who have been overlooked by traditional venture capital. Women, people of color, anyone with a brilliant idea and the determination to see it through. And he had been scheduled to meet with a young woman named Denise Carter that following Monday. When Charles saw Margaret throw those coins, he set down his fork. When he saw Denise get on her knees, he leaned forward. When he saw her collect every single penny with steady hands and a straight spine, he made a decision. He had reviewed her pitch deck already. The software was impressive. The market potential was obvious. But what he had witnessed that night told him something no business plan ever could. He saw how she handled humiliation. He saw her grace under pressure. He saw character. And in 40 years of business, Charles Monroe had learned one unshakable truth. You can teach someone skills. You can teach them strategy. You can teach them how to negotiate, how to manage, how to lead. But you cannot teach character. That a person either has or they don't. Denise, that Sunday night, in her small apartment, Denise practiced her pitch one more time. The twins helped, pretending to be serious investors, asking questions like, "Mommy, what an algorithm?" That made Denise laugh for the first time in days. Monday morning, she pressed her best outfit, a navy skirt and white blouse she had bought at a thrift store 3 years ago, a blazer borrowed from Charlene, slightly too big in the shoulders but professional enough. She looked in the mirror and took a deep breath. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Character is built in the fire, not in the comfort. Denise Carter had been through the fire. Now it was time to see what she had become. She walked into Davidson and Monroe Capital at 9 o'clock sharp, her flash drive in her purse, her pitch deck memorized, her dignity fully intact. She had no idea that the man waiting in the conference room had watched her kneel on a restaurant floor 48 hours earlier. And what Charles Monroe said to her at the end of that meeting would change not just her life, but the entire future of American technology. Charles Monroe looked at Denise for a long moment after her presentation ended. The silence in that conference room was deafening. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown Atlanta. The flash drive was still connected to the presentation screen. Equal Pay's interface glowing with the elegant code Denise had spent 18 months perfecting. She sat with her hands folded on the table, heart pounding but face calm. She had given everything she had. Now it was up to him. "Young lady," Charles finally said, "I've heard a lot of pitches in my 40 years in this business. CEOs with fancy degrees, entrepreneurs with family money, tech geniuses who couldn't look you in the eye. But I've never heard one quite like yours." He leaned forward, and Denise held her breath. "I'm going to invest $5 million in your company." The words hit her like a wave. $5 million. More money than she had ever imagined. Enough to build Equal Pay into everything she had dreamed. Enough to change her daughter's lives forever. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "Mr. Monroe, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything yet," he replied, "because I have one condition." Denise nodded, bracing herself. "I want you to quit that waitressing job. Today. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Today. You're too talented to be serving food to people who don't appreciate you. I'll provide a salary advance so you can focus full-time on building this company." Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't stop. But the question that came out surprised even her. "How did you know about my job?" Charles smiled, a knowing smile that held decades of wisdom. "Because I was at the Grand Peachtree last Saturday night. I saw what happened. I saw how that woman treated you. And more importantly, I saw how you handled it." The room fell silent again. Denise felt exposed, vulnerable. The shame of that night, the humiliation she had tried to bury, was suddenly laid bare before the stranger. But Charles wasn't finished. "Miss Carter, in 40 years of business, I've learned that you can tell everything about a person by how they respond to humiliation. Anyone can be dignified when things are going well. Anyone can be confident when they're winning. But dignity under pressure? Grace when someone is trying to break you? That's rare. That's valuable. That's the foundation of true leadership." He stood and extended his hand. That night, watching you collect those coins with your head held high, refusing to give that woman your tears, refusing to let her steal your dignity, that told me everything I needed to know about your character. Denise stood and shook his hand. His grip was firm, his eyes kind. "Miss Carter, I believe you're going to change the world, and I want to be there when you do." The next 3 years moved like a whirlwind. By the end of 2016, Equal Tech Solutions was officially launched. Denise hired her first 3 employees, rented a small office space in a shared building in Decatur, and began reaching out to corporations that had faced wage discrimination lawsuits. Her pitch was simple: pay me now to fix your systems, or pay lawyers later to fix your reputation. Companies listened. By spring of 2017, Equal Tech had its first Fortune 500 client. A major retail chain facing a class action lawsuit agreed to implement Equal Pay across all its locations. Within 6 months, they reported a 40% reduction in payroll-related complaints. Within a year, other corporations came calling. The press took notice. Incorporated magazine ran a feature on Denise titled "The Software Revolutionary, Changing How America Pays Its Workers." Fast Company named her one of their most creative people in business. CNBC invited her for an interview where she spoke calmly, confidently, about the importance of equity in compensation. But through it all, Denise never forgot where she came from. She moved her mother out of the nursing home, where she had been receiving minimal care, and bought her a beautiful house in Marietta with a garden and a porch swing. She hired full-time caregivers who treated her mother like family. She established the Marcus Carter Foundation, named after her late husband. The foundation provided financial assistance to families who had lost loved ones in workplace accidents. It also funded legal aid for those fighting predatory insurance companies, the same companies that had tried to destroy her. Her twin daughters, Jasmine and Joy, were now thriving. They attended one of Atlanta's most prestigious private schools. They had their own bedrooms for the first time in their lives. They had college funds that would ensure their futures. And every night, before bed, Denise reminded them of their father. "Your daddy worked with his hands," she would say, "but he dreamed with his heart. Never forget that." Equal Tech grew beyond anything Denise had imagined. By mid 2018, they had expanded internationally. Offices in London, Singapore, Sao Paulo. Contracts with corporations across 6 continents. The software that Denise had built alone, in stolen moments, on library computers, was now protecting the paychecks of millions of workers worldwide. By early 2019, the company was valued at $8.2 billion. Denise Marie Carter, the woman who had knelt on a restaurant floor picking up coins, was now one of the wealthiest self-made women in American history, and she ran her company the way she wished the world worked. Every employee at Equal Tech, from the janitors to the executives, received a living wage with full benefits. Every voice was valued in meetings. Every person was treated with the dignity they deserved, because Denise knew what it felt like to be invisible. She refused to let anyone in her company feel that way. When Forbes magazine contacted her about being on their cover, her first instinct was to say no. "I don't need the attention," she told Keisha, her publicist. "The work speaks for itself." But Keisha pushed back. "Denise, do you know how many little black girls are going to see that cover? Do you know how many women are going to see your face and think, if she can do it, maybe I can too?" This isn't about your ego. This is about representation. This is about showing the world what's possible. Denise thought about her daughters. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about every woman who had ever been knocked down and had to find the strength to get back up. "Fine," she said, "but I'd do the interview on my terms." Forbes agreed. The interview took place in Denise's office in Midtown Atlanta, a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. On her desk sat 2 framed photographs, one of Marcus, smiling in a construction gear, one of the twins, arms around each other, matching grins. The journalist, Elizabeth Harper, spent 3 hours with Denise. They talked about her journey, her struggles, her triumphs. They talked about the technology, the mission, the future. And at the end, Elizabeth asked one final question. "Denise, you've overcome so much. Is there anything, any moment, that stands out as a turning point? A moment that defined who you became?" Denise was silent for a long moment. She thought about the coins. She thought about the cold marble floor. She thought about the silence of 50 people who watched and said nothing. Then she smiled. "There was a night," she said slowly, "when I was working as a waitress. A customer treated me poorly, very poorly. She humiliated me in front of an entire restaurant." Elizabeth leaned in, sensing there was more. And in that moment, Denise continued, "I had a choice. I could let that humiliation break me. I could let anger consume me. Or I could use it as fuel. I could let it remind me of exactly why I was working so hard." She looked directly at Elizabeth. "I chose fuel, and I never looked back." The interview was published in early March 2019. The cover showed Denise standing in front of her office building, dressed in a tailored navy suit, her head held high, her eyes filled with quiet power. The headline read Denise Marie Carter, the self-made billionaire who's changing the face of American tech. And that was the magazine cover that landed on Margaret Ashford's doorstep one Sunday morning. The cover that made her teacup shatter on the Italian marble floor. The cover that stopped her heart. Because when Margaret Ashford saw Denise's face, she didn't just feel shame. She felt something far more dangerous. She felt terror. Because Margaret Ashford had a secret she had buried for over 30 years. And seeing Denise Marie Carter on that Forbes cover threatened to expose everything. What that secret was would change everything you think you know about this story. Margaret Ashford hadn't slept in 3 days. Not since she saw that face on the Forbes cover. Not since she realized that the woman she had humiliated, the woman she had forced to kneel and pick up coins like a beggar, was now one of the most powerful businesswomen in America. But it wasn't guilt keeping her awake. It was fear. Because Margaret knew something about Denise Carter that Denise herself might not know. A connection that went back over 30 years. A secret that, if revealed, could destroy everything Margaret had built, everything she had stolen. The Monday after she saw the magazine, Margaret made a phone call to a man named Richardson. He ran a private investigation firm that specialized in discretion. The kind of firm that wealthy people used when they needed information without questions. I need you to find out everything about a woman named Denise Marie Carter, Margaret said. Her family history, her parents, her grandparents. Go back as far as you can. And I need it fast. Richardson didn't ask why. He never did. He simply quoted his fee and said he would have the report within 72 hours. Those 3 days were the longest of Margaret's life. She paced her bedroom at night, unable to sit still. She jumped at every phone call. She drank more bourbon than usual, trying to steady her nerves. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Denise's face on that magazine cover. Those calm, powerful eyes that seemed to look right through her. On Thursday morning, the report arrived, a thick manila envelope, heavy with documents. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it. Her eyes scanned the pages, looking for the information she dreaded finding. And there it was, Denise Marie Carter, born 1982, Memphis, Tennessee. Mother, Cassandra Carter, maiden name Jenkins. Grandmother, Loretta Mae Jenkins. The papers fell from Margaret's hands. She grabbed the edge of her desk to steady herself, her breath coming in short gasps. Loretta Mae Jenkins, a name she hadn't spoken in over 30 years, a name she had tried so desperately to forget. To understand why that name stopped Margaret's heart, I need to take you back to 1987, to a secret so dark that Margaret had buried it beneath decades of charity galas and society functions and carefully constructed lies. William Ashford, too, was Margaret's husband. He was the heir to Ashford Textiles, one of the largest fabric manufacturers in the Southeast. He was wealthy beyond imagination, connected to every powerful family in Georgia, and absolutely, completely cruel. Margaret had married him when she was 22 years old. Not for love. There was no love in William Ashford. She married him because that's what women of her station did. They married well. They secured their futures. They endured, and endure she did. For 30 years, Margaret endured William's rages, his belittling comments, his cold silences that could last for weeks. He never hit her, not physically, but there are ways to destroy a person that don't leave visible bruises. William was an expert in all of them. Margaret stayed because she had nowhere else to go. She had been raised to be a wife, nothing more. She had no skills, no education, no way to support herself. And William controlled everything. The money, the properties, the social connections. Leaving him would mean leaving with nothing. So she waited for him to die, for his weak heart or his heavy drinking or his general meanness to catch up with him. She waited for the inheritance that would finally set her free. But in the final years of his life, something changed. William became paranoid. He was convinced that Margaret was plotting against him, trying to steal his money. He started watching her every move, tracking her spending, interrogating the servant about her daily activities. And then he met Loretta Mae Jenkins. Loretta was a young black woman who worked as a housekeeper in one of the Ashford properties in Midtown Atlanta. She was 28 years old, beautiful, and kind in a way that William Ashford had never experienced. She didn't cower before him. She didn't fear him. She treated him like a human being. And for reasons even William couldn't explain, that kindness broke something open in him. The affair began in the summer of 1986. William visited the property more and more frequently, finding excuses to be near Loretta. Eventually, he stopped pretending. Loretta didn't know he was married at first. By the time she found out, she was already pregnant with his child. When Margaret discovered the affair, she expected to feel rage, betrayal, jealousy. Instead, she felt nothing. Let him have his mistress, she thought. Let him have his fun. As long as he dies eventually and leaves me what's mine. But then she discovered the will. It happened by accident. Margaret was passing William's study late one night when she heard voices. William and his lawyer, a man named Henderson who had served the Ashford family for decades. She pressed herself against the wall, outside the door. I want it ironclad, William was saying. Margaret gets nothing. Not the house. Not the business. Not a single stock certificate. Everything goes to Loretta and our child. Henderson tried to protest. William, your family has held these assets for generations. If you do this, there will be questions. I don't care about questions. William snapped. Loretta is the only person who has ever truly loved me. She and our child will inherit everything. Margaret can go to hell. Something inside Margaret snapped in that moment. 30 years. 30 years she had endured this man's cruelty. 30 years she had waited for her freedom. And now, because of some housekeeper, because of some affair, she was going to be left with nothing? No, she couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't let that happen. Over the next few weeks, Margaret made a plan. William had a heart condition, managed with medication he took every night before bed. The pills were kept in his study, in a small bottle on his desk. On a cold January night in 1987, Margaret slipped into the study, while William slept in the adjoining bedroom. Her hands were steady as she opened the pill bottle. She had purchased identical-looking sugar pills from a pharmacy across town, paying cash, giving a false name. She replaced half of William's heart medication with the sugar tablets. Then she closed the bottle, placed it back exactly where she found it, and returned to her room. Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret watched her husband's health deteriorate. He complained of fatigue, of chest pains, of shortness of breath. He saw doctors who adjusted his medications and told him to rest. But nothing helped. On a cold February morning, William Ashford II suffered a massive heart attack in his study. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. The doctors called it natural causes. A weak heart finally giving out. No one suspected anything. No one had any reason to. The will, the new will that left everything to Loretta Mae Jenkins, mysteriously disappeared. Henderson, the lawyer, who owed Margaret several favors related to certain gambling debts, claimed it had never been properly executed. The original will, the one that left everything to Margaret, was filed with the courts. Margaret Ashford inherited the house, the business, the accounts, every penny her husband had accumulated over generations of Ashford wealth. And Loretta Mae Jenkins? She was fired immediately, escorted off the property by security guards before she even had time to collect her belongings. She was pregnant, terrified, and completely alone. Margaret had her lawyers send a letter making it very clear that if Loretta ever spoke about her relationship with William, if she ever tried to make any claim on the Ashford estate, she would be destroyed, scandalized, run out of whatever life she tried to build. Loretta Mae Jenkins went back to Memphis, Tennessee, where she was from. She raised her daughter alone, a daughter she named Cassandra. She never spoke of William Ashford again. She buried that chapter of her life so deep that even her own daughter didn't know the full truth. Cassandra grew up, married a man named Robert Carter, and in 1982 had a baby girl she named Denise. Denise Marie Carter, the same Denise who had knelt on Margaret Ashford's floor, picking up coins. The same Denise who was now on the cover of Forbes magazine. The same Denise who was, by blood, the granddaughter of William Ashford II. The same Denise who was the rightful heir to the Ashford fortune. Margaret stared at the investigation report, her mind racing through the implications. If the truth came out, if anyone discovered the connection between Denise and William, everything could be challenged. Lawyers would get involved. Courts would get involved. The inheritance Margaret had stolen could be contested. But that wasn't even the worst of it. If someone started digging into the past, if someone started asking questions about William's death, about the pills, about the timing, about the will that disappeared, everything would unravel. Margaret would lose everything. She might even go to prison. For 3 days, she considered her options. Option 1 was to do nothing. Pray that Denise Carter never discovered the truth. Hope that the connection between them remained buried forever. Trust that the past would stay in the past. But that was too risky. Denise was powerful now. She had resources. If she ever decided to look into her family history, she might find things, might ask questions, might uncover secrets. Option 2 was darker. Margaret didn't let herself think too long about option 2. She wasn't that person. Not anymore. Not directly, at least. Option 3 was more subtle. Reach out to Denise Carter. Apologize for what happened at the restaurant. Offer a charitable donation. Something generous that would seem like genuine remorse. Keep her enemies close. Make sure Denise never had any reason to investigate the Ashford family. Margaret decided on option 3. She would write a letter. She would invite Denise to dinner. She would charm her, befriend her, and ensure that the past stayed exactly where it belonged. But here's what Margaret didn't know. Denise Carter already knew everything. Loretta Mae Jenkins was still alive, at 91 years old. She was living in a beautiful house in Memphis, the same house that Denise had bought for her when Equal Tech became successful. The grandmother who had raised Denise with wisdom and love and the philosophy that character is built in the fire. 6 months before the Forbes interview, Loretta had asked Denise to sit with her on the porch. The sun was setting over the Mississippi River, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Baby girl," Loretta had said, "there's something I need to tell you, something I've carried for over 30 years, something about your grandfather." And then she told Denise everything, about William Ashford, about the affair, about the pregnancy, about the will that was going to change everything, about being sent away with nothing, about the pills she had found once, hidden in Margaret's dresser, pills that didn't match what should have been in the bottle. Denise had listened in complete silence, her hand holding her grandmother's. When Loretta finished, Denise asked only one question. "Grandmama, what do you want to do?" Loretta had squeezed her granddaughter's hand with surprising strength. "Baby girl, I don't want revenge. I've lived my life. I made peace with God a long time ago. But what I want, what I've always wanted, is for the truth to be told. Not for money, not for revenge, but because the truth matters. It always matters." Denise had held her grandmother's hand and made a promise. "Then the truth will be told, but in my own time and in my own way." So when Margaret's letter arrived at Equal Tech headquarters, printed on heavy cream paper with gold embossing and the Ashford family crest, Denise knew exactly what it meant. She read the invitation 3 times. The formal language, the mention of charitable partnership, the request for a dinner meeting at the Ashford estate. Then she smiled. She had been waiting for this moment. Margaret Ashford thought she was setting a trap. She had no idea she was walking into one. Denise Carter pulled up to the Ashford estate in her black Tesla, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as she approached the massive iron gates. She paused for a moment before stepping out, taking in the view before her. The mansion sprawled across perfectly manicured grounds, like a monument to old money. Marble fountains caught the evening light. Sculpted hedges lined pathways that probably cost more to maintain than most families earned in a year. Every window gleamed. Every stone was immaculate. This was the house that should have been her mother's. This was the legacy that should have belonged to her family. Denise took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. She smoothed her tailored black dress, adjusted the simple gold earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, and walked toward the front door. Tonight wasn't about claiming what was owed. Tonight wasn't about money or property or inheritance. Tonight was about truth. And tonight, Margaret Ashford was going to learn exactly who she was dealing with. The door opened before Denise could knock. Margaret stood in the entrance, wearing an elegant silver dress and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ms. Carter," Margaret said warmly, "thank you so much for coming. Please, come in." Denise stepped into the foyer and looked around, taking her time. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that must have been 20 feet high. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls. Portraits of Ashford ancestors staring down with cold, superior eyes. A sweeping staircase curved upward, its banister polished to a mirror shine. "Beautiful home," Denise said calmly. "It's been in my family for generations," Margaret replied, watching Denise's face carefully for any sign of recognition, any hint that she knew more than she should. "Has it?" Denise met Margaret's eyes. "How wonderful." They moved to the formal dining room, where a 5-course meal had been prepared. The table was set with china that probably cost more than Denise's first apartment. Candles flickered in silver holders. Wine worth hundreds of dollars sat breathing in crystal decanters. For the first hour, they made small talk, business strategies, philanthropic initiatives, the state of technology, Atlanta's changing social landscape. Margaret was charming, gracious, the perfect hostess. But Denise saw what Margaret tried to hide, the slight tremor in her hands when she reached for her wine glass, the way her eyes kept darting to Denise's face searching for something. The fear that lived just beneath the polished surface. Margaret Ashford was terrified. She just didn't know that Denise already knew why. Over dessert, a delicate chocolate souffle that neither woman had appetite for, Margaret made her move. "Denise," she said, pausing to ensure she had Denise's full attention. "May I call you Denise?" "Of course." Margaret set down her fork and folded her hands on the table. "I have to confess something to you." Denise raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "We've met before," Margaret continued, her voice carefully controlled. 3 years ago, at the Grand Peachtree restaurant." The silence stretched between them. "I behaved poorly that night," Margaret said. "Very poorly. And I've thought about that evening many times since. The way I treated you, the things I said, She paused, searching for the right word. "The coins. It was inexcusable. I'm deeply, deeply ashamed." She reached across the table and placed her hand on top of Denise's. The gesture was meant to seem sincere, but Denise felt the calculation behind it. "I would like to make it right," Margaret continued. "I'd like to donate $10 million to your foundation, the Marcus Carter Foundation. Consider an apology, a way to begin repairing the harm I caused." She smiled, confident that money could fix anything. It always had before. Denise looked at Margaret's hand on hers. Then she looked up at Margaret's face, and she smiled. "That's very generous, Margaret, but I'm afraid I can't accept." Margaret's smile faltered. "Excuse me?" Denise gently pulled her hand away. "Because I'm not here for your money." The color began to drain from Margaret's face. "Then why are you here?" Denise leaned forward slightly, her voice calm and steady. "I'm here to tell you that I know." Margaret stopped breathing. "No what?" "I know about William Ashford." The words landed like stones in still water. Margaret's face went white. "I know about Loretta Mae Jenkins," Denise continued. "I know about their affair. I know about the pregnancy. I know about the will, the Rayall will, that was supposed to leave everything to her and their child." Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. "And I know about the pills." The room seemed to shrink. The candlelight flickered. Margaret gripped the edge of the table like a woman drowning. "That's," she stammered, her composure completely shattered. "That's not, you can't, how could you possibly?" "My grandmother is still alive," Denise said simply. "Loretta Mae Jenkins. She's 91 years old. She lives in Memphis now, in a beautiful house I bought for her. And she told me everything." Margaret's hands were shaking visibly now. "Everything you did, everything you stole, everything you covered up." Denise reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. She placed it on the table between them. "I have documentation," she said. "Letters that weren't destroyed as completely as you thought. Pharmacy records that should have been discarded but weren't. Testimony from a pharmacist in Marietta who remembers a nervous, wealthy woman buying sugar pills in January 1987. Payments made to a lawyer named Henderson to lose certain documents." Margaret stared at the folder like it was a coiled snake. "I could take this to the police," Denise said, her voice still perfectly calm. "I could take it to the media. I could take it to a courtroom and challenge everything you inherited. By blood, I am William Ashford's granddaughter. By rights, half of everything you own should belong to my family." Margaret was trembling now, tears forming in her eyes. "Please," she whispered. "Please, I'll give you anything. I'll sign over whatever you want. Just please, don't." But Denise held up her hand. "I'm not going to do any of those things." Margaret looked up, confusion cutting through her fear. "What?" Denise stood, straightening her dress. "My grandmother doesn't want revenge. She never did. She made peace with God a long time ago. She's lived her life with dignity, despite everything you took from her. She raised my mother alone. She helped raise me. She taught me that character is built in the fire, not in the comfort." She picked up the folder. "What my grandmother wants is the truth. And now you know that someone else knows the truth. You'll have to live with that knowledge for the rest of your life. Knowing that your secret is no longer yours alone. Knowing that everything you build is standing on a foundation of murder and theft and lies." Margaret sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. "I'm keeping this folder," Denise continued. "Consider insurance. If you ever try to harm me, my family, or my company, if you ever send investigators or lawyers or anyone else to cause us trouble, everything goes public. Every document, every record, every piece of evidence." She paused at the doorway. "But as long as you leave us alone, your secret dies when you do. That's more mercy than you showed my grandmother. More mercy than you deserve." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, and Margaret?" Margaret looked up, broken. "Those coins you threw at my feet 3 years ago, I still have them. Every single one. I keep them in a crystal jar on my desk at Equal Tech." She smiled. "They remind me that the people you step on your way up might just be waiting for you on your way down." And with that, Denise Marie Carter walked out of the Ashford mansion and into the cool Atlanta night. She didn't look back. Margaret Ashford III passed away in her sleep 8 months later. The official cause of death was a heart attack, the same condition that killed her husband 32 years earlier. The doctor said it was sudden, peaceful. She simply didn't wake up one morning. She died alone in that massive mansion, surrounded by priceless furniture and artwork and all the trappings of wealth, with no one by her side. Her daughter Victoria had died in a car accident years before. Her granddaughters had been Victoria's stepchildren, with no legal claim to the Ashford estate. There were no blood relatives left. When her lawyers opened her will, they found surprise. 3 weeks before her death, Margaret had changed her final testament. The entire Ashford fortune, every property, every stock, every account, was to be donated to the Marcus Carter Foundation. No one knew what had changed her mind. Some said it was guilt, finally catching up after all those years. Others said it was fear, a final attempt to buy peace. A few, those who understood how grace and justice sometimes intertwine in unexpected ways, said it was something that almost looked like redemption. Denise Carter never spoke publicly about her connection to the Ashford family. When the donation was announced, she simply issued a statement saying that the foundation was grateful and would use the funds to help families in need. She donated every penny to causes across the Southeast, schools in underserved communities, hospitals that serve patients regardless of their ability to pay, community centers in neighborhoods that had been forgotten, programs for families who had lost loved ones to workplace accidents. Not a single dollar went into her own pocket. She continued to build Equal Tech into one of the most successful and most admired companies in American history. A company built on the principle that every person deserves to be compensated fairly. A company that practiced what it preached. And every Sunday, without fail, Denise drives to Memphis. She visits her grandmother Loretta in that beautiful house on the hill overlooking the Mississippi River. They sit on the porch, sipping sweet tea, watching the sunset. Sometimes they talk about the past, about Marcus, about the twins, who are now teenagers with dreams of their own, about the long road from that one-bedroom apartment in East Point to the cover of Forbes magazine. Sometimes they talk about the future, about the foundation's work, about the lives being changed, about the legacy being built. But mostly, they just sit in comfortable silence. 2 generations of strong black women who survived everything the world threw at them, who refused to be broken by cruelty, who prove that character truly is built in the fire. The coins still sit in a crystal jar on Denise's desk at Equal Tech headquarters. Visitors often ask about them, curious about the collection of quarters and dimes and nickels and pennies displayed so prominently. Denise always tells them the same thing. Those coins are worth exactly $52.18. But the lesson they taught me, that's priceless. And now, in the halls of the Grand Peachtree Restaurant, which is still standing in Buckhead but under new ownership, a black businesswoman who used to wait tables there, they tell a story. They tell it to new employees during training. They tell it to customers who ask about the history. They tell it because some stories deserve to be remembered. It's the story of a woman who was knocked down and got back up, a woman who was humiliated in front of a room full of people who said nothing and who responded with grace instead of rage, a woman who turned coins scattered on a marble floor into a reminder that circumstances don't define you, Your character does. And that, my friends, is the story of Denise Marie Carter, the waitress who ended up on the cover of Forbes, the granddaughter who reclaimed her family's truth, the woman who proved that the fire that's meant to destroy you can also be the fire that forges you into something unbreakable. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that better days are coming even when the nights seem endless, if it made you believe that justice still exists in this world even when it takes its time arriving, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember this, the people who look down on you today might just be looking up at you tomorrow. This is Unheard Black Voices. Stay blessed, stay strong, and remember that your story isn't over. Now I have to ask you something. Do you think Denise made the right choice by not going to police? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear what you think. Until next time,